The church bells had barely finished ringing when the first whispers began drifting through the sleepy streets of the little southern town. It was an ordinary Sunday morning. The air carried the crisp chill of late autumn, and a thin blanket of mist clung to the old oak trees surrounding the oldest church in the county. Families dressed in their finest clothes slowly made their way toward the weathered wooden doors, greeting neighbors with warm smiles that had been exchanged for generations. Nothing about the morning seemed unusual, until a long, black Cadillac appeared at the end of the gravel road. The engine was almost silent. Its polished body reflected the pale sunlight as it rolled toward the church, moving slowly enough for everyone to notice. Conversations stopped one by one. Children who had been chasing each other across the churchyard suddenly froze. Even the birds resting on the ancient stone fence seemed to fall strangely quiet. The Cadillac came to a gentle stop directly in front of the church entrance. For several long moments, nothing happened. People stared without speaking. An elderly woman tightened her grip on her Bible. A young boy tugged at his father's sleeve. "Who is that?" His father narrowed his eyes but couldn't answer. The driver's door opened first. A sharply dressed man stepped out, quietly walked around the vehicle, and reached for the rear door. The entire church courtyard seemed to hold its breath. Then, the door slowly opened. A polished black shoe touched the gravel. Another followed. A familiar figure stepped into the morning light. Dark hair, a perfectly tailored suit, the unmistakable face recognized across the world. Elvis Presley. For a heartbeat, no one moved. No one breathed. Then whispers erupted from every corner of the churchyard. "It's him. It can't be. That's Elvis. The king himself." Some people smiled in disbelief. Others instinctively reached into their pockets, wishing they had something for an autograph. Several teenagers stared, as though one of their dreams had suddenly stepped into reality. But not everyone looked impressed. Near the church steps stood several elderly deacons who had served the congregation for decades. One of them slowly folded his arms across his chest. His weathered face showed neither excitement nor admiration, only concern. "So," he murmured quietly, "the king of rock and roll has come to church." Another deacon sighed. "I wonder whether he came to worship or to be seen." A woman standing nearby lowered her voice. "I've heard about his concerts. They say women scream before he even sings." Someone else added, "They say entire stadiums shake when he walks on stage." The oldest deacon looked toward the wooden cross above the church entrance. His expression never changed. "Fame may fill stadiums," he whispered, "but fame has never opened the gates of heaven." Those words drifted through the silent morning air. And they reached Elvis. He heard every single one. Every whisper, every doubt, every judgment. Yet he never turned around. Not once. Instead, he simply stood beside the Cadillac for a brief moment, looking up at the old church. It was nothing like the arenas he had grown accustomed to. No bright lights. No photographers. No cheering crowds. No screaming fans. Just faded wooden walls that had stood for generations. Simple stained glass windows. A weathered bell tower. And a wooden cross that seemed almost untouched by time. For reasons he could not explain, his heart began beating faster. The building looked strangely familiar. Not because he had ever visited this church, but because it reminded him of another one. A tiny wooden church from his childhood. Long before the records. Long before the fame. Long before the world had crowned him the king of rock and roll. Back when he was simply Elvis, a little boy sitting beside his mother, listening, learning, believing. For the first time that morning, his confident smile disappeared. The memories arrived without warning. His mother's gentle hands, Sunday mornings filled with gospel hymns, voices rising together without applause, without money, without fame, only faith. The memories struck him so suddenly that he almost forgot where he was. His driver quietly stepped closer. "Mr. Presley." Elvis didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the old church doors. For a long moment, he simply stood there, as though the weight of the entire world rested on his shoulders. He had performed before presidents. He had faced crowds so massive they stretched beyond the horizon. He had walked onto stages surrounded by blinding lights, deafening cheers, and cameras from every corner of the world. Yet none of those moments had ever made his heart race like this. Finally he spoke. His voice was so quiet that only the driver could hear. "I've sung before millions." He paused. "But somehow, walking into this church feels harder than walking onto any stage." The driver looked surprised. "I thought nothing made you nervous anymore." Elvis smiled faintly. "So did I." For another few seconds, neither man spoke. The morning breeze gently stirred the fallen leaves across the gravel path. Somewhere in the distance, another church bell echoed through the town. It sounded strangely familiar, almost like an invitation. Elvis took a slow breath. Then another. Without another word, he began walking toward the entrance. Every step across the gravel echoed through the silent courtyard. The crowd instinctively moved aside, creating a narrow path between the church doors and the waiting congregation. No one asked for an autograph. No one reached for his hand. No one called his name. Only moments earlier, they had been looking at the world's biggest entertainer. Now, they were watching a man carrying something much heavier than fame. Each step seemed slower than the last. As he reached the worn wooden doors, he stopped once again. His fingers gently rested against the weathered wood. The surface felt rough, cold, worn smooth by generations of believers who had entered seeking forgiveness, hope, comfort, or peace. Thousands of ordinary people had touched these same doors. Farmers, factory workers, teachers, mothers, children, soldiers returning from war, widows carrying broken hearts. None of them had arrived with fame. Yet every one of them had entered carrying something invisible. Elvis slowly lowered his head. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes. The roaring crowds, the flashing cameras, the endless applause, they all faded into silence. Only one memory remained. A little boy standing beside his mother in a tiny wooden church, his small hands holding an old hymn book, his young voice trembling as he sang about grace. Back then, he had never dreamed of becoming famous. He had only dreamed of singing. Very slowly, he opened his eyes. Then he stepped inside. The sanctuary welcomed him with complete silence. Golden morning light poured through the stained glass windows, covering the old wooden floor with brilliant shades of crimson, sapphire, emerald, and gold. Tiny particles of dust floated through the light like countless stars suspended in the air. Candles burned quietly beside the altar. The scent of aged wood, candle wax, and well-worn hymn books filled every corner of the sanctuary. It felt peaceful, sacred, timeless. One by one, people turned toward him. Every face recognized him immediately. Some smiled with admiration. Some watched with uncertainty. Others quietly bowed their heads. Not a single voice broke the silence. Even the choir remained perfectly still. Children who had struggled to sit quietly all morning suddenly stopped moving. An elderly woman gently closed her Bible. A young man removed his hat. Every eye remained fixed on Elvis. The silence grew heavier with every passing second. Then, from the far end of the sanctuary, a woman slowly rose to her feet. She wore no sparkling jewelry, no expensive gown, no symbol of celebrity. She needed none. The quiet dignity in her presence filled the entire church. Mahalia Jackson, the Queen of Gospel, the woman whose voice had carried hope through countless churches, comforted broken hearts, and reminded people that true worship needed no applause. She looked directly into Elvis's eyes. There was no excitement in her expression, no judgment, no envy, only calm wisdom. For several long moments, neither of them moved. Two legendary voices stood facing one another. One had conquered the greatest stages on earth. The other had spent a lifetime singing for something far greater than applause. The congregation could almost feel the tension between them. No orchestra played. No piano touched a single note. No choir dared to sing. Even the wind outside seemed to stop. Mahalia finally took one slow step forward. Then another. She stopped only a few feet away from Elvis. Her calm eyes never left his face. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, gentle, yet every word echoed through the silent sanctuary. Elvis. She paused. The whole world says your voice can shake stadiums. The silence deepened. She slowly turned and looked toward the old wooden cross standing behind the altar. Then she looked back into his eyes. But tell me. She paused one last time. Her next words seemed to stop every heartbeat inside the church. Can it still reach heaven? The question hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Can it still reach heaven? No one breathed. The sanctuary became so silent that the faint crackle of burning candles sounded almost deafening. Every face turned toward Elvis. Some waited with hope. Others waited with doubt. A few secretly expected him to smile politely, offer an excuse, and quietly walk away. After all, he was Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, a man whose concerts sold out before the stage lights were even switched on, a man who had spent years surrounded by roaring crowds, television cameras, and endless applause. This was different. There was no spotlight waiting for him, no orchestra preparing an introduction, no microphone standing at center stage, only an old wooden cross, a silent congregation, and one simple question. Mahalia took another slow step toward the altar. Her calm voice broke the silence once again. Today, there will be no band. She looked toward the empty choir loft. No orchestra. Her eyes returned to Elvis. No microphone. She paused. No audience waiting to cheer. The words settled deep into every heart inside the church. Only you. She pointed gently toward the altar. Your voice. Another pause. And God. The sanctuary seemed to grow even quieter. If the little boy who once sang gospel hymns beside his mother still lives inside you. Mahalia's voice softened. Then let him sing. Not Elvis Presley. Not the king. Not the superstar. Just the little boy. A ripple of emotion swept through the congregation. Several choir members lowered their eyes. An elderly man slowly removed his glasses and wiped them with a trembling hand. Near the back of the church, One of the deacons quietly folded his arms. "We're about to find out," he whispered, "whether fame strengthened his faith or buried it." The words reached Elvis. He didn't react. His eyes remained fixed on the wooden cross. For the first time in many years, he didn't know what to do. His hands trembled almost imperceptibly. Not from fear of singing. He had sung before millions without hesitation. This fear was different. It came from somewhere much deeper. He wondered whether the voice that had conquered the world had wandered too far from the faith that had first given it life. The memories returned, not as flashes, as living moments. He saw himself as a child sitting beside his mother on an old wooden pew. He remembered her gentle smile as she turned the pages of a worn hymn book. He remembered the warmth of her hand resting on his shoulder. Most of all, he remembered what she used to whisper before every service. "Don't sing so people will hear you." She would smile. "Sing so God will know your heart." Those words struck him harder than any applause he had ever received. His throat tightened. For a brief moment, the famous performer disappeared. Standing before the congregation was simply a son remembering his mother. Several long seconds passed. No one moved. The silence became almost unbearable. One little girl, sitting near the front, quietly looked at her father. "Why isn't he singing?" Her father gently squeezed her hand. "I think," he whispered, "he's trying to remember who he is." The church remained perfectly still. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the stained glass windows. Somewhere beyond the hills, another church bell echoed through the valley. Its lonely sound drifted into the sanctuary. Elvis slowly lifted his eyes toward the cross. His breathing became steadier. Then, very slowly, he began walking. Each step echoed across the worn wooden floor. No music accompanied him. Only the quiet sound of polished shoes touching old timber. The distance to the altar was only a few yards. Yet it felt like the longest walk of his life. With every step, the applause of stadiums faded farther away. The headlines disappeared. The gold records vanished. The screaming crowds became silent memories. By the time he reached the altar, only one thing remained: faith. He stopped before the cross. His hands rested quietly at his sides. His eyes closed. For several seconds, nothing happened. The congregation waited. Some believed he had lost the courage to sing. Others feared the silence itself had become his answer. Mahalia never spoke. She simply watched, not with expectation, but with compassion. She knew some battles could never be fought with words, only with the heart. Then, Elvis drew one slow, trembling breath. His lips parted. The first note escaped so softly that several people leaned forward just to hear it. It was fragile, almost broken. Nothing like the powerful voice that had electrified arenas across the world. Yet there was something unmistakably genuine within it. The second line carried a little more strength. The third revealed quiet confidence. By the fourth, something extraordinary began to happen. The church no longer heard the king of rock and roll. They heard a humble young boy singing exactly as he once had beside his mother many years before. Without pride, without performance, without pretending to be anyone else. Only truth, only worship. An elderly woman covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face. One member of the choir quietly dropped to his knees. The skeptical deacon who had doubted Elvis at the church entrance slowly lowered his head. His folded arms relaxed. His eyes filled with tears he could no longer hide. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. Every heart inside the sanctuary was listening to something far greater than a famous voice. The hymn continued to rise through the old wooden church. Gentle, honest, powerful. It felt less like music, and more like a prayer finding its way home. Mahalia slowly closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek. She realized something remarkable. Elvis was no longer singing to the congregation. He wasn't singing for history. He wasn't singing for his legacy. He wasn't even singing for himself. He was singing for the one who had heard his very first hymn long before the world ever learned his name. As the final verse approached, no one dared to move. Every soul in the sanctuary sensed that something unforgettable was about to happen. And when Elvis opened his eyes for the final lines of the hymn, he looked directly toward Mahalia. She smiled through tears. Then, almost invisibly, she nodded. It was all the encouragement he needed. Elvis took one final breath and sang the last verse with every ounce of faith still living inside his soul. No one in the church was prepared for what happened next. The final note lingered beneath the old wooden ceiling long after Elvis's lips had fallen silent. It did not disappear all at once. It seemed to float gently through the sanctuary, brushing against every stained glass window, every weathered pew, every heart that had gathered there that Sunday morning. Then, silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind of silence that follows a moment too sacred for words. No one applauded. No one shifted in their seat. No one even looked at the person beside them. For several long moments, the entire church stood completely still. The only sound was the quiet crackling of the candles beside the altar. An elderly woman slowly lowered the hand that had covered her mouth. Tears streamed freely down her face. She had attended that church for more than half a century. She had heard hundreds of sermons, thousands of hymns, yet she had never witnessed anything quite like this. Near the back of the sanctuary, the deacon who had questioned Elvis that morning remained frozen. His Bible slipped slightly from beneath his arm. His eyes never left the man standing before the cross. Only minutes earlier, he had seen a celebrity. Now, he saw a humble believer. Quietly, he bowed his head. "Lord," he whispered, "forgive me for judging what only you could see." Several members of the choir wiped tears from their faces. One young singer looked toward the choir director. "I've never heard anything so beautiful." The director gently shook his head. It wasn't beautiful because of the voice. He smiled through tears. It was beautiful because every word came from the heart. Across the sanctuary, a little boy tugged softly on his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, "why is everyone crying?" His mother knelt beside him and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. "Because sometimes," she said quietly, "God reminds people who they really are." The child looked back toward Elvis. He didn't fully understand, but somehow, he felt it too. At the altar, Elvis slowly opened his eyes. His breathing was calm now. The fear that had followed him through the church doors had vanished. For the first time in years, his shoulders felt lighter. Not because the world had forgiven him, but because he had stopped trying to carry the weight of the world. Mahalia watched him for a long moment. There was no need to hurry. Some moments deserved time. Very slowly she walked toward him. Each step echoed softly across the old wooden floor. When she finally reached him, she smiled with quiet warmth. She placed one gentle hand on his shoulder. The congregation leaned forward. No one wanted to miss a single word. Mahalia looked into Elvis's eyes. Then she spoke. "Today," she whispered. Heaven did not hear the king of rock and roll. A tear rolled gently down her cheek. Heaven heard the little boy. She paused. Who first learned to sing for God. The words settled over the sanctuary like a blessing. Elvis lowered his head. His eyes filled with tears. For a moment he could not speak. When he finally found his voice, it was almost a whisper. "I spent years searching for something I thought success would give me." He looked toward the wooden cross. "But this morning," he smiled through tears, "I found something I never should have lost." No one clapped. No one shouted. The silence itself became the greatest expression of respect. Then, one by one, people quietly stood. Not to honor a celebrity. Not to celebrate a performance. But to give thanks. Some folded their hands in prayer. Others embraced husbands, wives, children, and lifelong friends. Several choir members gathered near the altar, softly humming the same hymn Elvis had just finished. Soon, voices from every corner of the church joined together. There was no conductor, no arrangement, no rehearsals, just ordinary people singing with extraordinary faith. For the first time that morning, Elvis was no longer singing alone. He quietly stepped away from the center of the altar and blended into the congregation. No one asked him for an autograph. No one reached for a photograph. They simply sang together. Equal before God. When the final hymn ended, sunlight poured through the stained glass windows more brightly than before, bathing the sanctuary in warm shades of gold and crimson. It felt as though the old church itself had come alive. Outside, the black Cadillac still waited on the gravel road. Its polished body reflected the afternoon light. It was ready to carry Elvis back to a world of concerts, cameras, and endless expectations. But before leaving, he turned for one last look. The old wooden church stood quietly beneath the autumn sky. Simple, weathered, unforgettable. He smiled. Not the famous smile that had filled magazine covers across the world. A different smile. Peaceful. Grateful. The smile of someone who had finally remembered where his journey began. Without another word, he climbed into the Cadillac. The engine started. The car slowly disappeared beyond the oak trees. Life in the little town eventually returned to normal. The church bells rang again the following Sunday. Families gathered as they always had. Children laughed in the courtyard. The choir sang from the same worn hymn books. Yet something had changed forever. Years later, those who had been inside that sanctuary would still speak about that quiet Sunday morning. Not because one of the world's most famous entertainers had walked through their church doors, but because they had witnessed something infinitely greater. For a few unforgettable moments, a man who had spent his life chasing the applause of millions rediscovered the quiet faith of one little boy. No cameras captured it. No headlines could fully explain it. No recording preserved the sound that filled the sanctuary that morning. Perhaps that was exactly how it was meant to be. Because some songs are too sacred for history. They are remembered only by the hearts that heard them. And on that cold Sunday morning, the greatest performance Elvis Presley ever gave was the one the world never saw.